I want to be great at pre-release events. Now, if you're watching this, you probably do too. But part of being great requires that you make mistakes. It's how you learn and get better. I entered 3 Edge of Eternities pre-release events and man, did I make mistakes. But I did learn a couple things. So here are the 5 lessons that I learned and how they can help you at your next event. A quick disclaimer here, I'm mostly going to be talking about Two-Headed Giant whenever I'm referencing the games. This first one is really the only one that's specific to Two-Headed Giant, so just stick with me. At my last event of the weekend, I looked at my black and white pool and just immediately snatched them up. My goal there was to make a godlike deck that would just carry both of us through the event. That was ill-advised, and it backfired. Because Two-Headed Giant is a team game, you have to be really strategic about how your decks interact and what they're both trying to do together. You can't leave one teammate just drowning, begging for a chance to make an impact on the game while you just play all the good cards. You're really just putting yourself at a disadvantage. So going forward, my mindset for these events is going to be, you put more rares in both decks, you're twice as likely to draw a rare. So there are a few things to think about when you're deciding what colors to take. What synergies are you trying to build? Do you have removal? How do your 2-drops look? And how many creatures do you have in your 2-drop slot? And then what's your rarity split? When I looked at the blue pool for this event, the answer to all of these questions seemed bad. There weren't any rares, it was stuffed with more commons than any other color we had, and at first glance, it just didn't seem like blue was gonna work. But there were 3 problems to these assumptions. The first was that black was our second best removal, and it's also pretty much the best removal in the game, especially in this set. Putting the 2 best colors together into one deck with white and black not only weakened the other, it put too much stress on my deck to do everything. The second problem was without black or blue, the other deck just kind of struggled to get into the game. Our red and green just didn't really have the support or strength to really participate in the 2v2. And the third problem with this assumption was that I was just wrong. Our blue wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was, and in comparison to the green, it was an A+. So the real problem stemmed from me just not wanting to play blue in the first place. I was basically just creating an excuse to not play that color. Pre-release is a wacky experience. You need to play the hand you're dealt, even if that playstyle isn't what you're used to or want to play. I'm not a huge control player, so Azorius was something I just kind of naturally stayed away from, and I definitely wouldn't consider myself someone who enjoys winning via a busted mill card. But pre-release events are weird. There's just a ton of variants. So embrace the weird, try new stuff, and have some fun. Limited is won by the creatures on your board, usually, but it's also lost by not being able to remove those creatures. Every limited deck is different, but it's worth remembering this overall structure just as a rule of thumb. 2 1-drops, 7 2-drops, 6 3-drops, 4 4-drops, that's the easiest way to remember that, 3 5-drops, and then 1 6 or higher cost card. Within that, you want to have around 16 creatures and 7 spells. Before I go into any event, I like to read up on what removal cards are expected to be good and then look for those in my pool. It's helpful to know what's considered to be pretty good and what you should be avoiding. Prioritization is pretty important. Speaking of prioritization, prioritize your rares. My teammate Shawn and I went 2-1 at this event after we got milled out with a space-time anomaly in game 1. But here's the thing. We also had a space-time anomaly, and a celestial colonnade, and a station monitor, which is basically a rare, but none of those cards were in the first iteration of either of our decks. Mostly because I wasn't playing white-blue. Like an idiot. That was pretty stupid, and this advice is about as obvious as it gets, but it's still worth saying. Play those rares. They're gonna win you games. Now, I wanted to go over the decks that we built, and I've already shuffled in all of the bulk from the event, so sorry I don't have the full card pool, but I want to show you what we built and kind of how they played out. These decks were really cool, and I especially loved the white-blue deck, even though I said that's not my usual playstyle, so let's check them out. Kicking this off with perhaps the strongest card in our pool, Cosmogrand Zenith was one of the first cards we pulled. It did a ton of heavy lifting in our games, and this is basically a kill on sight card if you have removal. If you don't, you're probably just gonna lose the game. After Cosmogrand Zenith was not 1, but 2 Exalted Sunborns. We knew a go-wide strategy with white involved was probably going to be happening at this point. I wanted to force black because it's kind of the best of the go-wide strategies with the right cards, but white-blue was the dark horse of the event. After the Exalted Sunborns was another Angel. Lightstall Inquisitor caused some serious damage. It was my turn 1 play in 2 of the 3 games, resulting in a tapped land down the road in each case, but it saw play in all 3 games due to the final Angel in this deck we'll talk about later. Moving on to the utility side of my rares and mythics, Hardlight Containment was kind of a nasty little thing. It's a banishing light but in aura form, which you'd immediately think is a bad thing with all the removal running around, but it was fantastic alongside Lumen class Frigate. Because of the Ward 1 that Hardlight Containment gives, Lumen class Frigate, if it never turns into a creature, is incredibly difficult to remove. There is some artifact removal in this set, but for the most part, it's hidden in green, and green doesn't want to play most of those cards. There's a couple in red too, but they're not particularly good. Now, specifically due to Lumen class Frigate, the next card, Pinnacle Starcage, could be a little bit clunky, but it was a fantastic piece of utility in my first 2-headed giant event earlier in the day, and certainly worth including in this one. If the game ever got away from us, this was a really good card just to kind of hit a reset on all the smaller stuff, and then we could focus on killing the bigger stuff down the road. There were 2 Azorius cards in my rare pile. The first was Space-Time Anomaly. It's a finisher in 2-headed giant since you're often milling for 30, and Celestial Colonnade is a tapped land that can turn into an absolute beater for 5 mana. These 2 cards were honestly fantastic, which makes you wonder how I missed them in the first place. Moving into the uncommons, Station Monitor was the final multicolor card in this deck, and it's basically a rare. These little flying gizmos can quickly become problematic, especially alongside something like Exalted Sunborn. Honor is a lot worse of a card now that I know it's not an instant, it's a sorcery. I didn't know that until I threw a draft thinking it was an instant and I could cast it as a combat trick, but Unending Whisper was a very good card in Tarkir, and this does that, plus adding on a +1/+1 counter in decks that want it. So it's a card that replaces itself for only 1 mana. You're almost always going to have 1 mana, and despite it not being an instant, I still thought this was a pretty good card. Dual Sun Adepts and Rayblade Trooper are both really great board presences, but for very different reasons. Rayblade Trooper helps boost your board, especially with Warp, and ensures you'll basically never run out of creatures. But once you've amassed a large enough army, you kind of need something that's going to end the game. With that in mind, Dual Sun Adepts comes onto the battlefield for another Tarkir-esque ability. The big difference between this card and Tarkir's Banner of Glory is the double strike, which turns Dual Sun Adepts into just an incredibly potent combat threat. Ilvoy Infiltrator can chip away at your opponent each turn, while also giving you the card draw that's kind of necessary for you to continue doing that. There's a few +1/+1 counter things in this deck that can turn this into a big problem, but even just a flat 1/3 being able to draw you cards is super solid. A personal favorite of mine in this set, Codecracker Hound, is basically Sibsig Appraiser 2.0. You can warp in Codecracker Hound to pick your favorite card off of the top 2, and then you can always hardcast it later. I'm not sure what made me think our blue was bad, considering this was in our pile. And another card draw option that we had was Uthros Scanship. This card is super shiny. It takes a bit of work, but a 4/4 flyer for 4 is a pretty good rate. Now, there's one final uncommon card to talk about, and to be honest, it's one of my favorite cards in this set. It's Starfield Shepherd. Her 3/2 stat line is not that impressive, but her ETB allows you to grab a 1-mana creature, like Lightstall Inquisitor, or if you're in a pinch, a Plains. With Warp, you can do that twice. That's pretty insane value, I'd say. Moving into my commons, this is where the bulk of my removal sat. I had a counterspell with their Disaster, and 3 copies of Banishing Light. Sinister Cryologist was a card that I probably could have swapped for, well, literally anything, and it could have been better, but I'd seen chatter that players thought this would play better than it read. The 46.5% win rate it boasts now would probably say otherwise. Starbreach Whale isn't too much better, but for a 5-mana common, I like what it brought to the table. I had to have something in this slot, and I don't think this card is really that bad. However, for as lackluster as the other creatures in my common rarity are, Night Luminary is kind of a ray of sunshine in this deck. I really do love this card. Probably my favorite common in pretty much the entire set, and it just plays so clean. Warp it in on turn 2 for a 1/1, then hard cast it on turn 4 for what's functionally a 4/3. God, this card is just so sweet. So that was my deck. Here's what it roughly curves out to be. It's kind of heavy in the 3-drop spot, but Two-Headed Giant tends to be a little bit of a slower format, and with cards like Night Luminary, Exalted Sunborn, and Starfield Shepherd to be able to warp in on turn 2, this deck played out pretty quickly. So with Shawn's deck, he originally had a red-green deck, but my god was our green awful. If my deck was the hard carry full of like finesse and athleticism, Shawn's deck was the enforcer. It was there to knock people on their ass and make sure they stay there. Its job was not necessarily to win the game outright for us, but more so to put pressure on our opponents and just always keep them uncomfortable. So red-black is supposed to be an artifact sacrifice deck, which feeds directly into Rust Harvester's plan. With what is probably the saddest flavor text you've seen in recent history, this robot straight out of Wall-E consistently grows bigger to blast basically anything that moves. Shawn didn't get to use this much since it was really too scary to be allowed past the 1/1 body it starts with. People just constantly were sniping it when it hit the battlefield, but that kind of fed directly into our win condition since if his stuff is getting removed, mine isn't. His other rare was Extinguisher Battleship. Now, admittedly, this card is in a bit of a weird spot in Limited since it kills a land, usually, and basically every other creature, yours included. But it only takes 5 power to station this thing into a 2-turn win con, which makes it a fairly decent threat. We never actually ended up playing it, nor did any of our games really get to the point where 8 mana was actually coming into play, but regardless, we wanted to play our rares, and this was one of them. That is it for Shawn's rares. So jumping into the uncommons, we had Wefstalker Ardent. It's kind of an underrated card, at least in my opinion. It appears to be perfectly average in the stats, but having an Impact Tremors that also cares about artifacts was pretty sweet in this deck. With Wefstalker Ardent caring about stuff that entered the battlefield, having something that cared about stuff leaving the battlefield also felt pretty good. So we also had Caesarian Voidborn. It's kind of like a Blood Artist, but it's just stuff that you control. With an Impact Tremors on one end and a Blood Artist in the other, Shawn could very easily find ways to ping opponents down and put them under pressure, like I said before. So these are utility creatures. Dauntless Scrapbot was a cool little dude. He's an impressive 3/1 blocker that also interacts with various artifact synergies in the deck with his ETB Lander token, and just in general, he's a 3/1, so you're probably using him to block stuff that's kind of above rate for him, and no matter what, he still has that first ability just in case you need to remove someone's graveyard. You never know. Of course, there's this particularly nasty little treat in Shawn's Rakdos deck. Dubious Delicacy is an all-star card in the format for a multitude of reasons. Removal on top of life gain at instant speed, on top of removal of players. This card is definitely an all-star and something I would consider picking in basically any draft if black is still an option. Caesarian Dirgecraft is there because it targets each opponent to sacrifice a non-token creature, so you're usually killing people's most valuable stuff with this. If you're only killing something that's a little bit average, you can station this for 7 to turn it into a 4/3 flyer. Now, all of those are well and good. They're good utility up until this point, but the real MVP of Shawn's deck were not 1, not 2, but also 3, like my Banishing Light, 3 copies of Ruinous Rampage. Anything that hits each opponent is great in this format, and sorry if that's a little bit too specific to Two-Headed Giant and not really a format you play in, but this card was awesome. It's a 3 mana, deal 6 to your opponents, and with 3 copies in the deck, that is potentially 18 points of damage to their 30 health. I think we pulled one of these in each game, and every time we cast it, our opponents had a little bit of an eyebrow raise at how much damage they were about to take. So to finish up with the commons, we had 2 copies of Hole Carver in this deck. It's a really good deterrent for opponents that want to attack into you but don't want to trade their higher value creatures, which gave me time to build up the board and find a win con while also synergizing with Shawn's overall artifact theme. Keeping in theme with the each opponent part of what this deck was trying to do, Virus Beetle. Virus Beetle is just a good card in Limited. It forces each opponent to discard a card, so it's even better in Two-Headed Giant where you get a 2-for-1. But this was a card that I was looking for in basically every pre-release event I played in, just because it is super disruptive. A lot like my Lightstall Inquisitor, but even better because it actually forces people to discard cards versus letting them play those cards down the road. If you haven't noticed so far, this deck is effectively a control deck. Shawn ran 2 copies of Depressurize in here to snipe value engines or swing a fight as a combat trick. Those are well and good, but I was a little bit higher on Wormwall Sweeper than I probably should have been. That being said, it did feel pretty good all weekend to play. Surveil 2 was really impactful for searching for that next big play. Drill Too Deep was a bit of a filler, but the ability to destroy a random artifact was never a bad thing. And Rig of War is a combat trick that we're pretty used to seeing. +3/+0 and First Strike is honestly pretty fantastic for pumping creatures, especially mine, because it's a little bit difficult to predict opponents casting a combat trick on their teammates. It's a dynamic that's a bit specific to Two-Headed Giant, so not advice that's going to apply to your own limited games if you're just playing 1v1. But this did end up winning us our game 3 off the back of us basically casting this on a 1/1 token and it sniping just a way bigger creature on our opponent's side. But in order to find all these cards, Melded Moxite is in there to sift through pretty much all the chaff, like Drill Too Deep. I'm pretty high on this card still. It gives red some pretty good card advantage that later converts into a body. If you're in red-black, this is a great card. Orbital Plunge was also pretty great for that synergy, which is a lesson I wish I had known for the pre-release event I played before this one. I left 4 of these in my sideboard. It smokes basically every creature in the format with the upside of also making you a lander. The next 3 cards were basically filler, but they weren't without their own upside. Red Tiger Mechan can sneak in for quick 3 damage or station a spacecraft. Kov Landseeker is a difficult to block creature that adds metal to the pile with that lander token. Can be a little bit awkward to work around, but if you've got your foot on the gas, this is a very helpful card to draw into. And Nebula Dragon was a top-end card in Shawn's deck, but it was also just a little bit filler feeling. It's even more removal, or it's the last bit of burn needed to close out the game on a 4/4 flyer, so it's nothing bad. For 7 mana, it's just a little expensive. I'm really glad that we made the pivot we did because these decks were super sweet together. Thanks for watching this video. This is kind of the first time I've tried this format, so if you enjoyed it, make sure you like and subscribe and just let me know what you liked most. If you have ideas for improvement, feel free to drop those in the comments too. Until next time, peace.